My own sister tried to ruin my life, claiming I was a danger to my kids. But what she didn't realize was that her twisted game would end with her losing everything. I'm a 34-year-old single dad to two incredible kids, an 8-year-old son and a 5-year-old daughter. Life hasn't always been easy, but I've poured my heart into creating a loving, stable home for us. Then there's Danielle, my 37-year-old sister. On paper, her life with her husband Jacob and their two kids, aged 10 and 7, looked idyllic. A 6-figure corporate job, a big house in the suburbs, and a stay-at-home husband who seemed to have everything under control. But trust me, underneath that shiny veneer, a dark truth festered. Danielle and I were never close. Growing up, she was the golden child, the perfect one, while I was the rebellious one, the problem child who questioned authority and, according to our parents, gave them gray hairs. Danielle reveled in her success, always finding ways to highlight my perceived shortcomings. This continued into adulthood. Her helpful advice was always thinly veiled criticism. When I chose freelance graphic design, she called it a hobby job and questioned what kind of example I was setting. When my son took up dance instead of soccer, she acted like I doomed him to a life of bullying. And don't even get me started on the time she suggested I save for therapy because my daughter's favorite color was black instead of pink. That's just Danielle, always judging, always superior. The tension really began to boil at a recent family barbecue at our parents' house. My kids were just being kids, laughing, running wild with their cousins. Danielle, with that familiar condescending tone, loudly announced that I let them run wild, and that it was no surprise they never listened to anyone. I shrugged it off. Years of practice had taught me not to let her get under my skin. But I caught Jacob's side eye, that silent judgment, no doubt mentally comparing my natural parenting approach to their rigid, color-coded chore charts and screen time schedules. Jacob and Danielle were the epitome of helicopter parents. No sugar, early bedtimes, only educational TV. Jacob plastered their perfect life on Pinterest, but their kids always looked tired, living in a pressure cooker. And Danielle? She treated motherhood like a side hustle, glued to her phone at family events, only interjecting to bark orders or criticize someone else. A week later, my mom called, clearly uncomfortable. Danielle had been spreading vicious rumors, telling extended family members I was an unfit parent, too lenient, that my unstable lifestyle would ruin my kids. The ultimate blow? She'd hinted that someone should call Child Protective Services to step in before it was too late. My blood ran cold. This wasn't just criticism. This was an act of pure malice, a deeply personal betrayal. Then my worst fear came true. There was a knock at my door, and standing there were two CPS workers. An anonymous report about unsafe living conditions and neglect. My heart pounded. I let them in, cooperating fully. They were polite but thorough, asking questions about everything, even speaking to my confused but brave children. After an agonizing hour, the workers told me everything looked fine and they'd be closing the case. But I was left shaking, utterly violated by the experience. At the next family gathering, I decided to confront Danielle. I didn't accuse, just asked if she knew anything about the CPS report. That smirk, she said something about how people just want what's best for the kids, and sometimes it takes an outsider to see the bigger picture. I wanted to scream. My parents were furious when they found out, but still refused to cut ties, saying it was important to keep the family together. Jacob, of course, defended his wife, claiming she only ever acted out of love. That's when something shifted inside me. I couldn't trust them. I started a journal, meticulously noting every passive-aggressive jab, every questionable parenting choice I witnessed, every withdrawn look from their kids. I didn't know where this was heading, but I swore I wouldn't let Danielle and Jacob get away with this. Things began to unravel quickly. One evening, an unexpected notification popped up from someone I hadn't spoken to in years, an old friend of Jacob's. She started by asking if everything was okay, which immediately made me suspicious. Then she dropped a bombshell. Jacob had been venting about his marriage on private online forums. He felt trapped, she said, controlled by Danielle, who micromanaged every aspect of their lives, from their schedules to their finances. Jacob had even admitted in one post that he sometimes felt like another one of her children, instead of her husband. She didn't have screenshots, but suggested I check Danielle and Jacob's social media. That night I went down a rabbit hole. Danielle's social media was a polished performance of their perfect family. But the more I looked, the more cracks I noticed. Jacob often looked tense, and the kids rarely smiled naturally in the photos. There were also comments from Jacob's personal account that seemed off. Things like, "Another busy week but we made it through," or "Always so proud of my family." Statements that sounded like he was trying to convince someone, maybe even himself, that everything was fine. The next family gathering confirmed my growing suspicions. It was another barbecue, and Danielle's kids seemed utterly exhausted. Her youngest kept yawning, and the oldest flinched whenever Danielle raised her voice, even if it wasn't directed at them. They were quieter than usual, barely engaging with my kids. At one point, Jacob and I ended up in the kitchen together, and he let slip that his oldest had been having trouble in school. They'd started seeing a therapist for anxiety, but Danielle thought therapy was a waste of time, and only allowed it because the school recommended it. That caught my attention. After the barbecue, I decided to dig a little deeper. I reached out to a mutual acquaintance who worked at the kids' school. She couldn't give me specific details but mentioned that one of Danielle's kids had been struggling with anxiety, and a teacher had expressed concerns about the pressure they seemed to be under. The teacher also mentioned the child often seemed tired and on edge, which lined up with what I'd been noticing at family events. Around this time, I reconnected with Jacob's old friend, who shared more troubling stories. She told me that Danielle was known to yell at her kids when things didn't go perfectly. Jacob had once confided in her that Danielle's temper scared him, but he didn't feel like he could leave because he wasn't working and had no financial independence. The friend seemed genuinely worried, and so was I. My worry for the kids grew into a burning conviction. Danielle must have sensed my increased scrutiny because her attacks intensified. At the next family dinner, I had a single glass of wine with my meal, a rare treat since I don't drink much. Danielle, ever the opportunist, loudly commented on how I always have a drink in hand, and made a joke about me being the family's resident lush. It was a ridiculous accusation, but the way she framed it made it sound like I was an alcoholic. I knew it wasn't just a jab. It was another calculated attempt to undermine me in front of the family. That was it. After that, I started researching custody laws and what constitutes neglect or emotional abuse. This wasn't about revenge anymore, it was about protection. I began keeping meticulous records of everything. Every snide comment Danielle made, every detail I noticed about her kids' behavior, and even Jacob's subtle admissions. I saved screenshots of social media posts and started writing down things I overheard at family events. I debated anonymously reporting Danielle to CPS, but I decided to wait until I had enough evidence. I didn't want to risk having my report dismissed or worse, tipping her off before I could make a real case. The final straw came at another family gathering. Danielle was in full performance mode, talking loudly about how her parenting style was the reason her kids were so well behaved. Then, out of nowhere, she announced that my kids were probably going to end up in juvie if I didn't parent better. The room went silent. I looked over at my parents, who were clearly uncomfortable but said nothing. Later, one of my cousins pulled me aside and admitted she believed Danielle was emotionally abusive to her kids, but was afraid to speak up because of how intimidating she could be. Not long after that, Jacob sent me a cryptic text. He apologized for Danielle's unnecessary behavior, but when I tried to respond, he quickly backtracked, saying he shouldn't have said anything and asking me to ignore the message. It was clear he was scared. At this point, I started noticing Danielle's hypocrisy more and more. Despite her hands-on mom image, she frequently worked late and left Jacob to handle everything at home. The cracks in her perfect facade were becoming impossible to ignore. I decided it was time to act. Not to get back at Danielle, but to protect her kids. The more I learned, the clearer it became that they were the ones who truly needed help. I finally contacted a family lawyer. She listened intently, her advice clear. Document everything, focus on facts, not emotions. And she reassured me, as long as I kept my own parenting spotless, there was no way Danielle's retaliation could jeopardize my custody of my kids. I started building my case. Following her advice, I began reaching out to family members and friends who had witnessed Danielle's outbursts. Some were hesitant to get involved, but others, like my cousin who had already confided in me, agreed to provide written statements. Each account painted a clear picture. Danielle was controlling, quick to anger, and dismissive of her children's emotions. Jacob's old friend came through with screenshots of his private posts from years ago. These posts describe Danielle's yelling, her refusal to compromise on parenting decisions, and his increasing feelings of isolation. The pieces were falling into place. Then, a golden opportunity. I casually offered to help Jacob with school pickup one afternoon. He reluctantly agreed, probably overwhelmed and needing the extra hands. As we waited for the kids, I overheard a conversation between his oldest child and another student. The girl mentioned skipping lunch because Mom said I was getting chubby. My stomach twisted. Later, I gently asked Jacob about it, and he admitted that Danielle had been obsessing over the kids' eating habits, even going as far as to remove snacks from the house entirely. That was the tipping point. I filed an anonymous report with CPS, detailing everything I'd documented. I kept the focus on the kids, their anxiety, their apparent exhaustion, and the unhealthy pressure Danielle seemed to put on them. A few weeks later, CPS conducted a surprise visit to Danielle's home. While they didn't find evidence of physical abuse, they noted a high level of tension in the household and scheduled a follow-up. Her carefully curated image was starting to fracture. When news of the CPS visit got back to her, Danielle was furious. She confronted me at a family dinner, loudly accusing me of being behind the report. I denied it, keeping my expression neutral, and she stormed off. The rest of the family was left in an awkward silence, but I noticed a few of them exchanging knowing glances. It was clear that more people were starting to see through Danielle's act. The confrontation seemed to push Jacob to his breaking point. A few days later, he showed up at my house, visibly shaken. For the first time, he openly admitted how bad things were at home. Danielle's yelling wasn't just reserved for the kids. It extended to him too. She criticized everything he did, from how he managed the house to how he handled the kids' schedules. He confessed that he'd been thinking about leaving her but didn't know where to start. My heart ached for him. I gave him a list of resources: men's shelters, financial planning services, and legal aid. I also encouraged him to keep his own documentation, texts, emails, anything that could help if he decided to file for divorce. Meanwhile, Danielle, in her desperation, only dug herself deeper. She pulled her oldest child out of therapy, calling it a waste of time, and insisting that their problems could be solved with discipline. This only made things worse. Jacob's old friend, who had stayed in touch with me, shared more screenshots of Jacob venting about Danielle's decisions. The messages were damning, with Jacob explicitly mentioning how Danielle's actions were hurting their kids, and how powerless he felt to stop it. I also cautiously reached out to the kids' teachers, framing it as a concerned relative wanting to ensure the kids were okay without prying too much. I encouraged them to document any concerns they noticed. One teacher later mentioned offhand that they'd already been keeping notes after the oldest child broke down in class during a group project. If you're finding this story as intense as I lived it, do me a favor and hit that subscribe button. Your support helps me share more deeply personal, and sometimes unbelievable stories like this one. Danielle's public persona started to crack at the next family event. She lost her temper in front of everyone, yelling at her youngest child for spilling a drink. The room went silent as the child shrank back, clearly scared. My parents looked horrified, but no one said anything except for Jacob, who quietly led the kids out of the room. Later, a few family members privately approached me, acknowledging that they were starting to see what I'd been talking about. The turning point was undeniable. I got a hold of a voicemail Jacob had accidentally forwarded to me while we were discussing resources. It was Danielle, berating him for not controlling the kids better, calling him useless, and blaming him for their struggles in school. The tone was harsh, the language degrading. This was it, the undeniable proof. I took it straight to my lawyer. She helped me craft a plan to ensure Jacob and the kids could get the help they needed, while protecting myself and my own children from Danielle's inevitable retaliation. This wasn't about revenge anymore. It was about accountability and safety. And for the first time, it felt like Danielle's carefully constructed house of cards was about to come crashing down. Not long after I received that voicemail of Danielle berating Jacob, things began to escalate quickly. A few weeks later, CPS showed up at Danielle's house again. This time it wasn't because of my report. One of the teachers at her kids' school had anonymously reached out after noticing that Danielle's oldest had been crying in class and expressed fear of going home. CPS conducted another home visit, which only seemed to amplify the tension in their household. Though no physical abuse was found, the investigator made note of the emotional strain on the children and flagged the case for continued monitoring. Danielle's reaction to the second visit was explosive. She started pointing fingers at everyone in the family, accusing various people of working with CPS to sabotage her. She went so far as to accuse our parents, who had remained cautiously neutral until this point. Her paranoia only served to alienate her further from the extended family. Cousins who once defended her began to quietly distance themselves, unwilling to be dragged into her drama. Amidst this chaos, Jacob opened up to me again one evening. He showed up unannounced, looking utterly exhausted and stressed. For the first time, he fully admitted that Danielle's abuse wasn't limited to the kids. It extended to him as well. She would belittle him, blame him for anything that went wrong, and control every aspect of their lives, including their finances. He confessed he'd considered leaving but felt trapped because he had no savings and no support system outside of the family. My heart shattered for him, but this also gave me a clear path forward. We started quietly building an exit plan for him. First, I helped him research local men's shelters and legal aid organizations. Then we opened a separate bank account in his name, hidden from Danielle, where he could start putting away small amounts of money. It wasn't much, but it was a start. I also put him in touch with my lawyer, who began advising him on the legal steps he'd need to take if he decided to file for divorce and custody. Meanwhile, Danielle began targeting me directly. She cornered me at a family event, her face red with anger, and warned me that she'd make sure I lost custody of my kids if I didn't stay out of her business. I stayed calm, refusing to engage, but I made a mental note to document the interaction. Danielle's threats were empty, but they showed just how desperate she was becoming. Around this time, a new witness emerged. A neighbor of Danielle's approached me at a community event. They'd overheard a heated argument between Danielle and her oldest child, where Danielle had been shouting so loudly that the neighbor could hear every word through their closed windows. They described the language Danielle used as intimidating and said it left them concerned for the kids' well-being. The neighbor offered to provide a statement if it was ever needed, which felt like a significant win. The real turning point came at another family gathering. Danielle's oldest child pulled me aside while the adults were distracted. They admitted they felt scared all the time and didn't like going home. When I gently asked if they'd ever told anyone else, they shook their head, looking terrified of the consequences. It was clear they were desperate for help, but they didn't know how to ask for it. A few days later, I decided to confront Danielle directly in a neutral setting. I carefully laid out what I'd observed, her kids' anxiety, Jacob's exhaustion, and the reports from CPS, and tried to reason with her. Instead of listening, she doubled down, accusing me of being a home wrecker who was trying to ruin her family out of jealousy. It was pointless to argue, so I left, knowing that her refusal to acknowledge her behavior would only work against her in the long run. As Danielle's erratic behavior became more obvious, more family members began siding with me. My cousin, who had previously kept her distance, started actively supporting Jacob. Even our parents, who had tried to stay neutral for so long, began stepping in to support the kids, offering to babysit more frequently and subtly helping Jacob with small errands. With encouragement from all sides, Jacob finally took a significant step forward. He quietly met with a family lawyer, who helped him understand his rights and options. He began gathering his own evidence, texts, emails, and even recordings of some of Danielle's outbursts. With my help, he started building a custody case that would stand up in court. Then came the breaking point. At a family dinner, Danielle had a complete meltdown. It started over something small. Her youngest child accidentally spilled their drink, but it escalated into a full-blown shouting match. She yelled at Jacob in front of everyone, calling him useless, and berated her kids until they were in tears. The room was dead silent, everyone too stunned to speak. Jacob stood up, took the kids, and left without a word. After that, there was no going back. Jacob finalized his plans to leave and began preparing the legal paperwork to file for divorce and full custody. Meanwhile, I compiled all the evidence he collected, along with my own notes, to create a comprehensive case against Danielle. Danielle's kids started refusing to participate in family outings, citing anxiety. CPS began visiting more frequently, keeping a closer eye on the household. The family began rallying around Jacob, and Danielle found herself increasingly isolated. Jacob thanked me for my support and promised to see the process through. As we both prepared for what was to come, it was clear that Danielle's carefully constructed facade was crumbling. The worst was still ahead for her. But for Jacob and the kids, the future was finally starting to look brighter. The turning point came when Jacob officially filed for divorce and requested full custody of the kids. The legal paperwork outlined everything: emotional abuse, controlling behavior, and a toxic home environment. It was the culmination of months of planning, evidence gathering, and quiet determination. Danielle was blindsided. True to form, her first response wasn't self-reflection. It was retaliation. Danielle immediately tried to block Jacob's access to their joint bank account. He discovered this when his card was declined while trying to buy groceries for the kids. Fortunately, we'd anticipated this move. Jacob had already set up his own account with the help of my lawyer, and I stepped in to cover his immediate expenses until he could get everything sorted. It was a small victory, but it gave Jacob the confidence to keep pushing forward. Danielle didn't stop there. She launched a full-blown smear campaign against both Jacob and me, calling family members and mutual friends to set the record straight. She told anyone who would listen that Jacob's divorce filing was a lie, orchestrated by me, claiming I'd manipulated him into leaving her out of revenge. She painted herself as a victim, insisting she was just a strict but loving mother, and that Jacob was too emotional to handle parenting. It was exhausting, but most of the family had already seen her true colors. The people who mattered weren't buying her story. When the legal proceedings began, Jacob's lawyer came out swinging. The evidence was overwhelming. Testimonies from teachers who had noticed the kids' anxiety, screenshots of Jacob's private complaints about Danielle's controlling behavior, and documentation from CPS about the emotional strain in the household. Danielle tried to fight back by filing her own custody request, accusing Jacob of being an unfit father. She even tried to drag me into it, claiming I was orchestrating everything out of jealousy. It was laughable, but it showed just how desperate she was. The most powerful moment came when the kids were interviewed by their court-appointed guardian. Both of them said they felt safer with Jacob and didn't want to live with Danielle full-time. Their oldest even brought up Danielle's habit of yelling, and how it made them feel scared. Hearing their voices added immense weight to Jacob's case and made it clear that this wasn't just a messy divorce. It was about protecting the kids from further harm. When I was called to testify, I kept my focus squarely on the facts. I described Danielle's history of undermining Jacob's parenting, her volatile temper, and the devastating effect it had on her children. I presented screenshots, documented incidents, and even the voicemail she'd accidentally left berating Jacob. Danielle's lawyer tried to discredit me, implying that I was biased because of my strained relationship with Danielle, but the evidence spoke for itself. There was no spinning the mountain of proof against her. Danielle's attempts to bring in character witnesses backfired spectacularly. A few people initially agreed to testify on her behalf, but most backed out before the trial. Those who did show up crumbled under cross-examination, admitting that they'd witnessed her controlling behavior or heard about her outbursts. Instead of strengthening her case, they made her look worse. Meanwhile, Jacob received overwhelming support from the community. Teachers, family friends, and neighbors wrote letters attesting to his fitness as a parent in the toxic environment Danielle had created. Even people who had stayed neutral up to this point began quietly siding with him. The tide was turning, and Danielle was losing control. The courtroom drama hit its peak when Danielle lost her temper during a hearing. It started with a minor disagreement about scheduling, but she escalated quickly, yelling at Jacob and even snapping at the judge. The judge warned her to control herself, but the damage was done. Her outburst only confirmed what everyone already suspected. Danielle's temper was a major issue and her home wasn't a safe environment for the kids. The fallout from her courtroom behavior rippled through the family. Those who had been on the fence cut ties with her, siding with Jacob and offering their support. Danielle found herself increasingly isolated, and her desperation became more apparent. As the date for the final custody ruling approached, Jacob's lawyer expressed confidence that the judge would rule in his favor. In a last-ditch effort to regain control, Danielle tried to discredit me. She dug up old personal information, stuff from years ago that had no bearing on the case, and tried to leak it to the family. It was a pathetic move and it backfired spectacularly. Instead of making me look bad, it made Danielle look petty and desperate. The family's opinion of her sank even lower, and I didn't even have to defend myself. Her actions spoke louder than any words I could have said. Now we were in the waiting game. The custody ruling was just around the corner, and there was nothing more we could do. The evidence had been presented, the witnesses had spoken, and the kids' voices had been heard. All we could do was wait and hope that justice prevailed. No matter what happened, I knew one thing for sure. Danielle's reign of control was coming to an end. The future for Jacob, for the kids, and for everyone she had hurt, was finally starting to look brighter. The custody ruling finally came in, and it was everything we had hoped for. The judge granted Jacob full custody of the kids, citing the overwhelming evidence of Danielle's emotional abuse and toxic behavior. Danielle was given limited, supervised visitation, a decision that hit her hard. The judge also ordered her to attend anger management classes and parenting courses before she could even request unsupervised visits. It was a clear, unambiguous acknowledgement of the damage she had caused, and it was the first real step toward protecting Jacob and the kids from her control. The aftermath of the ruling was not kind to Danielle. Her reputation, already shaky after her courtroom meltdown, took a nosedive. The family and community that had once respected her now saw her for who she really was. Even her staunchest allies started to pull away. It was as if everyone realized at once that her strict parenting was just a cover for her controlling, abusive nature. Without her facade of perfection, Danielle was left isolated and humiliated. Meanwhile, Jacob and the kids began their new life. He moved into a smaller but cozy home in a nearby neighborhood, where the kids could stay in the same schools. The change was immediate, breathtaking. The kids seemed lighter, freer. Therapy became a regular, positive part of their lives, and their oldest, who had struggled with anxiety and fear, started to open up more in school and at home. Teachers began reporting significant improvements in behavior and participation. The youngest blossomed in the calmer, supportive environment that Jacob created. The ripple effect of the custody battle reached the rest of the family too. Relatives who had stayed on the fence throughout the drama began reaching out to me, apologizing for not believing me sooner. They admitted they had brushed off my warnings about Danielle for years, but now, after seeing everything unfold, they couldn't ignore the truth. Felt vindicating, yes, but it was also bittersweet. Their apologies came too late to undo the harm Danielle had caused, but at least they were finally taking accountability. Danielle, of course, couldn't let things go. She attempted to rebuild her image on social media, posting staged pictures of herself during supervised visits with the kids and captions about how much she loved being a mom. But the response was what she hoped for. Her posts were met with skepticism and, in some cases, outright ridicule. It was clear that her attempts to save face weren't fooling anyone. The community saw through her efforts, and her once perfect image was permanently tarnished. As for Jacob, he started thriving in ways no one could have predicted. With the weight of Danielle's control lifted, he began exploring his independence. He took a part-time job at a local boutique, something Danielle would have never allowed him to do before, and started thinking about going back to school to finish his degree. His confidence grew day by day, and he became a role model for his kids in a way he hadn't been able to before. The resolution of the custody battle also had a positive impact on my own family. With the drama behind us, my kids no longer had to witness the tension that had hung over every family gathering for years. They started thriving in their own activities, and our home became a much happier, calmer place. It was a reminder of how much stress Danielle's behavior had brought into all our lives. One unexpected bright spot came from Jacob's old friend, the one who had initially reached out to me with the screenshots of Jacob's online posts. He reconnected with Jacob after the divorce, offering emotional support, and even helping him navigate the early days of single parenting. It was heartwarming to see Jacob rebuilding his support network and surrounding himself with people who genuinely cared about his well-being. Danielle's struggles didn't end with her reputation. The financial strain of legal fees, child support payments, and court-ordered classes started to take its toll. She had to downsize her own lifestyle significantly, selling off the flashy car she used to flaunt at family gatherings and cutting back on the luxury she'd once bragged about. It was a sharp contrast to the image she had tried so hard to maintain, And it left her with even less power to control Jacob or the kids. With the kids eventually thriving, CPS closed the case, declaring Jacob's home safe and stable. There was no need for further intervention. Danielle, however, remained on their radar, with occasional check-ins tied to her supervised visitation. It was a clear message that the system wasn't going to let her slip through the cracks. Toward the end of it all, Danielle tried to make amends with me. She approached me at a family event, offering what felt like a hollow, half-hearted apology for everything she'd done. I listened, but when she finished, I told her plainly that her actions were unforgivable. She had put Jacob, the kids, and me through hell, and no amount of apologies could erase that. I made it clear that while I hoped she could grow and do better, I wasn't interested in rebuilding any kind of relationship with her. As I reflect on everything, it's hard to believe how far we've come. What started as a simple family rivalry spiraled into something so much bigger, so much darker. But in the end, justice was served. Jacob and the kids are safe, thriving, and finally free from Danielle's control. My own family has found peace again, and the extended family is starting to heal. While there's still a long road ahead for everyone involved, I'm hopeful for the future. For the first time in years, it feels like we're all moving forward, on our terms, and without Danielle's toxic shadow hanging over us. This whole ordeal left me with such a complex mix of emotions: relief, sadness, vindication. I'd love to hear your take. Have you ever faced betrayal from a family member you thought you could trust? What would you have done in my shoes? Share your thoughts in the comments below. I truly want to know.